Everything you see feels real. The objects around you, the place where you are, the situations you live through, the people you interact with. But what if none of this is exactly what you believe it is? Most people live under the assumption that reality is something fixed, external, and independent, as if the world happens out there, and we're here just to observe it, respond to it, or try to control it in some way. But this way of seeing life, even though it seems logical, doesn't hold up when we start to look more closely, because at some point, something doesn't fit. There are patterns that repeat even when we change environments. There are sensations that persist even when reality seems to shift. And most of all, there's a growing discomfort when we realize that no matter how much we try to act upon the world keeps reflecting something that comes from within. What we call reality may be far less objective than we've been led to believe, and far more conditioned by our inner state than we imagine. Modern science already recognizes that matter, in its essence, is condensed energy, that the observer changes the behavior of what is being observed, and that everything that exists carries, to some extent, a frequency. This means that reality as we know it may not be a fact, but an interpretation, a projection shaped by perception, frequency, and consciousness. This understanding changes everything, because if what we see, feel, and experience is just a representation, then we're not stuck with what we're seeing now. What we call real may be just a temporary reading, one version among many other possibilities that exist but have not yet been accessed. The true prison is not the life we have, but how we've learned to perceive it. When our inner state remains the same, the reality around us also remains the same, because it responds to what we are, not to what we want. So the question is not whether reality is real, but to what extent it is a construction shaped by how you perceive, interpret, and respond to what's around you. Maybe what you believe to be solid, unchangeable, or external is just a subtle reflection of what you're putting out. And maybe this seemingly convincing reality is, deep down, just the visible part of a repeating vibrational pattern. That's the purpose of this video: to explore reality as a mirror, to reveal how consciousness interacts with the quantum field, and to show why what you call reality might just be the reflection of your own frequency, not to transform everything immediately, but to start seeing with more clarity. Because it's only when we question what we see that we begin to perceive what was never noticed before. But to understand why reality might be just a reflection, you have to go beyond what the senses show. You need to look more deeply into what truly sustains what we call the real world. First of all, it's important to understand that the illusion of reality gets stronger precisely because it seems consistent. But that consistency comes from the stability of the pattern being emitted. What we call reality is actually an interpreted experience. It's not the world itself that appears to us, but a reading that happens within our perception, conditioned by frequencies that we ourselves are sustaining. Basically, what your eyes see is light translated into forms. What you hear are vibrations converted into sound. And what you feel is the impact of that information on your state of consciousness. Everything goes through filters, interpretations, internal records. So reality is never raw. It is always shaped. That's why reality is an illusion in the most literal sense. It's not what it is. It's what we are able to perceive. At the most fundamental level, everything we see as the world is a vibrational response. In quantum physics, it's already understood that material reality is not made of solid blocks, but of particles that behave like waves of probability. These particles only collapse into a defined form when they are observed, that is, when they interact with consciousness. And it is precisely this phenomenon that supports the idea that what you perceive as reality is defined at the moment of perception. And perception, in turn, is guided by your vibration. This means that the way you feel, think, and interpret yourself is directly related to the way reality shows up for you. The quantum field is an invisible field of information, energy, and possibility. It's not physical, but it is present in everything. In it, there is no linear time, no fixed matter. What exists are infinite frequencies that can be accessed according to the vibrational state of the observer. The denser the vibration, the more limited the perceived reality. The more coherent and elevated, the broader the reading of the field. And this change in frequency alters the type of information captured, alters the content of perception, and consequently, alters the reality experienced. Frequency is the key that tunes your perception to a certain band of information. Like a radio that only picks up one station at a time, your consciousness only accesses the experiences that resonate with the signal you are emitting. And the more automatic this process becomes, the more convincing the illusion is that the world is just the way it is, when in fact, it's only a response to what you're tuned into. So, the quantum field doesn't respond to random wishes or intentions. It responds to the coherence between what you think, feel, and vibrate. And that coherence defines not only the quality of your perception, but the structure of your reality. That's why perception is not just a sensory function. It is a mirror of our state of being. And if perception shapes reality, then current reality is a faithful portrait of our vibrational field. Not the field around us, but the field we are generating from our consciousness. At the microscopic level, everything that exists is made of atoms. But atoms, in turn, are mostly composed of empty space. Most of their structure is made of energy distributed in a space that, in classical terms, would be considered empty. The electrons that make up this structure don't occupy fixed positions. They exist as probabilities of location, not as defined particles until the moment they are measured. Until they are observed, they are not at a specific point. They can be, and this difference is essential. They exist in a state of superposition, multiple possibilities at the same time, awaiting an interaction that defines one of them as concrete reality. This is the central point of quantum physics. Before becoming particles, the fundamental units of matter behave like waves and only collapse into something defined when they interact with an observer. This means that, at the most basic level, matter is neither solid nor out there independently. It's a statistical projection, a set of probabilities that only become real when observed. This phenomenon is known as the collapse of the wave function. Simply put, the physical world only defines itself when there is a consciousness interacting with it. And this breaks the classical idea that reality is something objective, that exists the same way for everyone, all the time. But reality is actually constructed, moment by moment, from the interaction between potential information in the quantum field and the way this information is observed and interpreted. And here we reach a crucial point. Observation is not neutral. It carries the vibrational state, emotional history, perceptual filters, and level of consciousness of the one who observes. So the wave collapse is the translation of energy into experience, mediated by what you are vibrating at that moment. So reality is not something that exists outside, waiting to be seen. It's something that is constantly updated based on how we observe, feel, think, and interpret. The physical world is an interactive response, not a fixed scenario. This response comes from the transitory manifestation of energy, organized according to specific frequencies, which start from your internal state, from your mental and emotional coherence, from your vibrational field. And the quantum field, in return, reacts to the vibrational quality of your consciousness. After all, before anything appears in the physical plane, it exists as information in the field, waiting for a frequency that activates it, that makes it visible. That's why the material world we live in is not the starting point. It is the final result of a much more subtle process. A process that begins with the quantum field, passes through consciousness, and only then is expressed as observable reality. This is the foundation that supports the entire understanding that reality is an illusion. Not because it doesn't exist, but because it's not what it seems to be. The solidity, permanence, and separation we perceive are visual and sensory effects of a deeper quantum and vibrational process, one that operates beyond our senses, but never beyond our influence. If what we observe only defines itself the moment it is observed, and if that observation is not neutral, then the role of consciousness becomes even more central in the construction of reality. We are not just interacting with the world. We are activating specific configurations of it based on what we're transmitting internally. In the quantum field, everything that exists is in a state of potential. There is no fixed form, no linear time, no predetermined events. There are frequencies, patterns of information, and entangled possibilities waiting for a specific condition to manifest. And as we saw before, that condition is the frequency of the observer. That's what determines which possibility becomes real and which one remains dormant in the field. Frequency here is not a subjective concept. It is a precise measure of the energetic quality of your state of being, a combination of thought, emotion, and inner coherence. Each emotional state carries a vibrational signature, and that signature behaves like a code that activates certain experiences in the field and ignores others. Basically, we live what we are compatible with. Reality, in this context, is not a response to desire. It's a response to frequency, because the quantum field responds to the vibrational consistency of who we are in the present moment. And that consistency is not just mental. We can think about change, want different results, affirm new ideas, but if the emotional base that supports those thoughts is still linked to fear, scarcity, or control, the real frequency we emit is still aligned with the old pattern. And that's the pattern that will keep getting activated, even if unconsciously. This is one of the reasons why many people feel frustrated when trying to change their lives, because they focus on the external form, on the visible reality, expecting it to change so they can then feel something different. But in the quantum field, it's the opposite. Vibration comes before experience. Inner change comes before external manifestation, since the quantum field responds to the energy that is being emitted. And when we recognize that the experience we're living is the reflection of what we're transmitting, we also begin to understand that reality can be altered, not forced, but intelligently influenced from a new vibrational state. That state doesn't depend on complex practices. It depends on presence, on coherence, on alignment between what you think, what you feel, and what you emit. And the more stable that frequency is, the more stable the new reality that begins to show up. In that sense, frequency acts as the determining factor that tunes your perception to a specific layer of reality. And what you live then stops feeling random. It starts to make sense as part of an energetic correspondence between your consciousness and the field of possibilities where everything already exists. If everything we experience comes from a frequency, then the question that arises is, who or what is emitting that frequency? This answer leads us directly to consciousness as the central point that regulates how we perceive, interpret, and interact with the field. Consciousness here dictates how we perceive, record information, and respond to the environment based on internal patterns. This activity is always on, even if automatically. And it's through this activity that the collapse of possibilities in the quantum field occurs. The way someone observes, interprets, and directs their attention directly influences what is measured, perceived, and even manifested. This means that consciousness doesn't just participate in reality, it interferes with the behavior of what is being observed. At the most subtle level of reality, where everything exists as unmanifested potential, nothing becomes real by itself. It is consciousness that selects, activates, and shapes what will be experienced. And this selection doesn't happen logically or rationally, but vibrationally. Consciousness, by emitting a specific pattern, resonates with specific parts of the quantum field, and it's this resonance that configures the experienced reality. And if consciousness is the origin point of lived reality, then the external experience becomes an organized reflection of the quality of our internal state. But this emission of consciousness doesn't happen just through what we think rationally. Here it's important to make a distinction. Thoughts are contents of the mind. Consciousness is what observes the thoughts. Emotions are responses of the body. Consciousness is the field where those responses happen. Reality, therefore, is not shaped by random thoughts or isolated emotions, but by the dominant frequency of our consciousness as a whole. And that dominant frequency is determined by deep factors, such as emotional patterns, automatic reactions, rooted beliefs, and mental structures consolidated over time. All of that is part of your vibrational signature, and it's that signature that defines which possibilities in the field you come into contact with. That's why, often, even with conscious effort, the results don't change. Because what comes from the conscious mind is only a fraction of what is being emitted by the whole of your consciousness. And that's not something negative. Quite the opposite. When we observe more clearly what is repeating in our lives, we're not seeing a punishment. We're seeing a precise reflection of what is still being emitted. And that reflection, no matter how uncomfortable, also carries transformation. Because if it's consciousness that configures reality, then it's from consciousness that reality can be changed. Not at the surface of thoughts, but at the base of the vibration that sustains those thoughts. This understanding gives back responsibility, but also autonomy. Because if consciousness is what emits the signal, then the real point of transformation is not in the outer world, but in how you're operating internally. And that's exactly why so many attempts to change fail, because they are still based on superficial actions, while the deeper pattern remains intact. It's not enough to want to change life. It's necessary to identify how consciousness is supporting exactly what you want to transform. Much of the frustration many face when trying to manifest comes from excessive focus on matter. They believe that to change reality, they must act directly on the physical world, force, control, repeat behaviors, mentally affirm that something will happen. But that reveals a basic misunderstanding, the idea that reality changes from the outside in. When someone tries to manifest something using only mental effort or repetitive behavior, without changing the internal state that sustains their perception, the result is instability. That explains why many changes seem to happen for a brief time but then fade. The vibrational pattern continues emitting the same information, and the field reorganizes external circumstances to reflect exactly that. When we try to manipulate results directly, without considering the vibrational origin that supports them, misalignment is created. This misalignment is the reason why reality seems to resist, repeat patterns, or even destabilize in the face of superficial change attempts. The most common mistake is trying to change external circumstances, hoping that will change the internal state, when in reality it's the opposite. Only when the internal state changes consistently can reality reorganize in a stable way, not because something was attracted, but because the frequency changed, and with it, everything that was compatible with the old emission lost relevance. That's why it's necessary to understand that the quantum field is activated by coherence. This coherence comes from the consistency between intention, emotion, and perception. This means it's not enough to want something. Your internal state must be compatible with what you want to experience. That compatibility is measured by how you feel about what you want, and that feeling cannot be forced. It needs to be real, integrated, legitimate. But if reality is a direct reflection of what we're emitting, then why do so many people keep reproducing the same patterns, even after understanding how reality works? The answer lies in the way we operate day to day, automatically. Most of our mental and emotional activity is not consciously chosen. It is reactive, conditioned, based on old records that keep being repeated as a standard response to what surrounds us. Even with new intentions, the system keeps emitting the same signals. And the field, loyal to vibrational coherence, just keeps reflecting that. This process creates a common feeling that we are trying to change, but something keeps pulling us back. The name we give to this may vary: resistance, self-sabotage, inner limitation, but in essence, it's an unconscious pattern that's still in control. A pattern that operates outside of presence, supported by emotional memories and interpretations that are no longer questioned. That's where the role of presence becomes essential, because the only way to interrupt an automatic projection is to be conscious at the moment it happens. Without presence, the mind reacts based on what it already knows. With presence, there's space to choose. And that choice is the beginning of a frequency shift. Presence changes brain dynamics, reorganizes attention, reduces reactive activity, and allows new information to be processed consciously. It's in this state that the pattern can be observed instead of just lived. When we become present, even for a few seconds, we stop operating as a reflection of the past and begin to operate as a point of observation in the now. And that breaks the automatic cycle of vibrational emission, because the pattern only stays alive while it is not seen. But when it's seen, it loses strength. And with that, consciousness stops projecting based on old records and begins to emit a new kind of information, more aligned with true intention, not with unconscious reactivity. But this process doesn't happen only at the level of thought. Presence involves the body, the breath, the perception of the moment. It's an integrated state that requires constant attention, not effort. It's a return to what is happening now, without the interference of mental narratives that distort or dramatize reality. The mind, once fragmented by stimuli and memories, begins to reorganize. And with that reorganization, the nervous system also starts to respond differently. The brain and body enter a different kind of rhythm, more stable, more integrated. And it's exactly at this point that it becomes possible to generate a new type of vibrational emission, coherence between brain and heart. Coherence, in this context, doesn't refer only to a positive emotional state. It represents a measurable alignment between the electrical activity of the brain and that of the heart. Various studies have already proven that the heart has its own electromagnetic field, wider and more powerful than the brain's. And when these two centers, mental and emotional, operate in sync, the pattern of information you emit to the quantum field becomes clearer, more stable, and more effective. In the state of coherence, the brain stops operating in disorganized waves, typical of stress and mental distraction, and starts to function with slower, integrated rhythms that support clarity and expanded perception. This means that an intention coming from a coherent brain has more precision and consistency, and the field in return interacts in a more orderly way with that kind of signal. On the other hand, the heart, when coherent, not only stabilizes physiological rhythms but also acts as an emotional modulator, adjusting the energetic tone of the intention. It works as a vibrational amplifier, and this factor is essential since the quantum field responds to the energetic charge associated with what is being emitted. When intention comes only from the mind, but isn't accompanied by a matching emotional state, the signal emitted to the field is inconsistent. It carries noise. The information arrives distorted, without enough vibrational strength to resonate with new possibilities. That's why true conscious creation requires coherence between thought and feeling. When there is clarity of intention and emotional congruence, the signal emitted is stronger, more stable, and more specific. And again, this state of coherence can be cultivated through presence. And as this coherence strengthens, the field begins to respond differently. Experiences that once seemed unlikely become natural. Synchronicities increase. Situations begin to reflect more precisely the stabilized inner state. All of this happens because the frequency being emitted finally becomes compatible with a new range of possibilities. At this moment, the concept of synchronicity starts to be understood as a logical consequence of energetic emission. Synchronicity, in this context, is an indication that the field is returning information in resonance with what was emitted. What once seemed like chance, such as encounters, opportunities, unexpected changes, subtle answers, begins to show up with more meaning. This response from the field happens naturally when there is vibrational consistency. Consciousness, once stabilized in a more ordered frequency, starts to activate parts of the quantum field that were previously out of reach. These parts, once accessed, collapse into events, circumstances, and connections that reflect the new dominant information. Recognizing this dynamic allows a new kind of clarity. What happens around you stops being interpreted as random, unfair, or disconnected, and starts being understood as a direct reflection of what is being sustained internally. This doesn't mean you control everything. It means you influence in real time what the field gives back to you. And that influence is happening right now, even if unconsciously. Reality doesn't respond only to what we want to live. It responds to what our current frequency allows us to access. And synchronicity is the first sign that this access has begun to change. So, when unlikely events begin to align, when opportunities show up without logical explanation, or when the right people appear at the right time, this is not luck. It's the field reflecting a new point of emission. It's reality reorganizing itself according to a change that has already occurred internally. This perception redefines the role of consciousness in the creation of experience. Instead of fighting against the world or waiting for it to change, attention turns to what is being vibrationally sustained. Because ultimately, that's what the field is listening to, and that's what it will keep reflecting with total precision. But this doesn't mean absolute control. It means vibrational responsibility. It means honestly observing what is being reflected and recognizing that reality doesn't lie. What we live is compatible with what we are emitting. Maybe the greatest illusion isn't in the world itself, but in the idea that it exists separate from the consciousness that observes it. When that separation is questioned deeply, what remains is the understanding that everything out there is, in fact, a reading of what's happening in here. Thank you for embarking on this journey with me. If this video resonated with you, I invite you to like and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with others so they can benefit from this message. And don't forget to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, reflections, and experiences. Thanks again for watching and for joining me. Take care and see you soon.